Greetings, friends. In this video, I'm going to respond to a few things which Ramsey Paul said recently. I have a lot of respect for Ramsey Paul. I recommend his content.
And another super chat here. Free Thinker Silver, Canadian $8. Does Ramsey believe in evolution or creation by God? That's a false dichotomy. They're not compatible, and Christians tie themselves in knots trying to accommodate the former. I believe in both. I believe there is God as a Christian, but I don't necessarily believe the Old Testament needs to be taken as literal, the Garden of Eden. I do think humans evolved from, not apes, we came from a similar ape-like creature. Even evolutionists don't think we evolved from monkeys. If we had a different span, but I think something happened to us spiritually and we became humans along the way with probably the Cro-Magnon. So to me, it's not an issue. I do definitely believe in evolution, and but at the same time, I also believe in God, and so I don't think but that's just my take on that. So
yeah, and it indeed is a sort of false dichotomy, because they handle two different questions. That evolution is about how life came to be where it is now. It doesn't take a stand on how matter and the world universe were created. That's not something the evolution is about. And if you consider creationism like the young earth creationism, that the biblical story of creation is the literal truth, then of course it contradicts with the theory of evolution, because beings can be both created as ready whole beings and evolve from lesser beings at the same time. But if you interpret creationism as this old world creationism that you described, that means basically believing that God created the universe and sort of planted the seeds for life to grow, but from there on it could have been evolution, then they don't even contradict each other.
Right.
Both at once.
Because scientists don't even no one knows how the universe came into existence. We just don't know. It doesn't make any sense. Even the scientists will tell you that. What happened before the Big Bang? Did it magically came into existence? I mean, no one knows, because those questions are so, we just don't have a way of knowing them. That's just so true. So I think we can work it out. And I think a lot of the Bible stories, even like Jonah, I don't think there was a Jonah that was swallowed by a great fish or a whale. But that's a story about how they're trying to get out of God's will. They don't want to do something they're supposed to do in their life, their mission. But because of events in their life, it forces them to do what they're supposed to do, which I've seen in my life happen. So I think that you need to look at some of those stories in that sense. So, and I think they understood that back in the time, that there were more of metaphors. But that's my belief, and I don't get too much into theology in this show because it gets people too upset. But since you asked, that's where I stand on that.
Metaphor is a figure of language using symbolism. So you describe something as another thing using kind of the pattern or the qualities associated with that other thing. So let's say a waterfall and the kid crying. So you say, oh, it was Niagara Falls. The kid dropped his ice cream and it was Niagara Falls. If I understand correctly, that would be using a metaphor. And then they say, technically a simile is related but different. It's where you use like or as. She was hopping as a kangaroo. Clearly she's not a kangaroo, but come on, that's English department level nitpickiness. I mean, creating the word simile, it's the same idea as a metaphor. So this is often the approach taken with people who address the Bible and Christian, teachings, traditional teachings. They'd say, well, it's metaphorical. And of course, I don't quite see how bringing up the metaphor with the regards to the creation of man, I don't see how that's very metaphorical. It's more clearly literal, because it says right in Genesis how man was created. There's no mention of any animal stage. Apparently in Judaism, before Christianity, they mention that man was created by God from dust, but it doesn't actually mention dust in Genesis account, but there's other instances throughout the Bible where they do mention man returning to the dust from which he came, which is more or less a suggestion that he came from dust. But then they don't actually mention dust in the actual Genesis account. Why would Moses leave that out? Was he trying to emphasize the spiritual quality that set man apart from mere matter or mere animals? That's my guess. I don't really know. I don't know what the church fathers would say. The dirt itself, yeah, we're made of atoms and molecules. That's not all we are, but I think evolutionists could latch onto that and say, oh, well, that's a metaphor for the evolutionary process. I mean, it still seems like a bit of a stretch there. The meaning is quite literal and clear. I don't see how you can say, well, it's a metaphor that you see, really, man came from this succession of endlessly, changing creatures. And then all the other things, that can of worms that opens up in terms of your worldview, which we'll get to. So I guess the thing I was trying to get at is, like, can meaning be literal and metaphorical? I think so, because there's obviously a lot of metaphor in the Bible, like Jonah being swallowed by the whale. That could be a metaphor for being, you're being caught in a situation which you are not prepared for, and you have done poorly to have yourself end up in such a bad situation. But by the grace of God, or by whatever your luck, you managed to survive. And people could legitimately read that into the story of Jonah surviving several days inside the belly of a whale. But I think this is a good example where the literal and the metaphorical overlap, because that's not discounting the literal meaning there. And if you do discount the literal meaning, you're in a bit of a dominoes falling down, because now if you question that, you start questioning other things in the Bible, like because I think it can be, obviously the Bible's a bunch of different books that were only assembled after centuries of the church being around. It took a while for that. But obviously there's instances where they might be like Psalms or David singing Psalms and like using more poetic language. But then obviously there's many places where they're trying to be very specific, and even so specific about certain things that people today still wonder why were they trying to be so specific. But the literal meaning is right. Like describing Solomon's temple. Yeah, Jonah really was swallowed by a whale. And there's a metaphorical meaning there. And if people are going to freak out and say, oh, you're a simple-minded fool, like, who cares about those people who are just going to jump to that conclusion? Don't worry about people thinking that you're crazy just because you think that something is described in the sacred book is actually true. That's pretty fundamental. And it's not just blind faith. It's taking them at their word based on the tradition. And you might say, well, the tradition it's controlling you, like David Icke says. But, these things are things we enact and experience in our own life by reenacting a lot of the stories and tropes. And not to make it all Jordan Peterson-esque, like, oh, the archetypes and all that. But, there are ways that we participate and we come to see a lot of the wisdom is true in our own life. So that's part of the equation there, about why we are willing to really believe these things that would seem supernatural to us, that would seem like, oh, you can't believe that, because who is your God? Is it logic? Is it materialism? Or what's your worldview? Because that's your God. So people are just trying to make these things which sound supernatural or impossible to us subservient to our current logic and current empirical, whatever, enlightened, inspired worldview. But if you focused on that and pointed the mirror into that, you would see that that's not founded on anything. That's why you need the stability of God. It makes sense if you think about it. Just because you can't see it and touch it directly right now doesn't mean it doesn't have a metaphysical reality. I mean, think of your best friend tells you that your house is going to be knocked down, and or the cops are coming, or there's a gas leak, or you got to get out of the house. Something serious like that, and your best friend, or maybe your family, also said that to you, but you didn't see this. You didn't observe any. You didn't observe the cops after you, or you didn't smell any or hear any gas leak in your house. But obviously, if you trust these people, something will change in you that you'll probably want to go along with what they're saying. And I don't think you can accuse a person who does that of being like, oh well, you're not being very rational, are you? You're not being very empirical, are you? It's the same. So obviously, there's reason to have faith in certain things in life. And just because we can't see just because the old patriarchs of the church and the apostles and Christ have departed the earth, and centuries have gone by, and Christians have come and gone and died and passed on their traditions. Just because we can't directly speak to them and see them right now doesn't mean that you cannot participate in that. I guess you might even say in the Holy Spirit, or participate in a good tradition. A lot of Christian philosophers who do apologetics and debate with atheists, they may get into a lot of science and debate from a materialist standpoint. So they accommodate science, and then they point out, you see, the Big Bang doesn't make sense. And how do the laws of physics do this? And a good one would be like evolutionists. They don't have enough time. Like their time scales need to be so big, so large to have all the years to account for random selection coming together and making these things. But you see, the thing is, you can do that, and I've done that. I mean, it's fine to point out incoherent things that don't add up. However, to engage in a debate when you're coming from a spiritual standpoint and someone else is coming from an evolutionary standpoint, you really ought not to get down onto conceding their main point, which is a naturalistic look on the world. You can't concede that like humans came from apes and then expect to argue for Christianity on the basis of science, which is what a lot of people are doing these days. Well-trained philosophers are doing that, but that's just, you've basically conceded a fundamental point to your opponent, and you've picked the worst hill to fight on, but you would lose anyways, because you've conceded like a basic point of your whole religion. So it's game over. It might take a while. You might squabble back and forth, but it comes down to my study, your study, or this theory, that theory. But the paradigm is against you. Is God's creation of the world in 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested? Is that a metaphor or a literal truth? I mean, I guess a scientist would say, well, when there was no earth to turn, and how would you have a day? But from a metaphysical standpoint, you might say, well, there is the day hanging out there, which I know a lot of rational materialists would say, well, that's ridiculous. There's nothing there. But then with mathematics, with any concept, you will never touch or find it, but it was always there and always will be there. I mean, the idea of any species or any mathematical figure or any concept like that, it exists in a metaphysical reality. I don't mean to sound too spaced out there, but that's just a higher order fact of reality. I don't know what the metaphor would be, because it's just a description of what the world was created. I mean, I guess if there was no day like there is today, then you would say they're using some other form to talk about what we now understand as a day. I don't know. You're just going to spiral down some weird rabbit hole there. May as well just take it as meaning a day, and maybe a day in the week are sacred numbers. It's not a coincidence that it ended up being a 7-day week. Noah and the flood, this may have a metaphorical meaning to it. It happened to Rome, I guess you could say. It happened to many civilizations coming past. It gets decadent and bad times come. And well, I guess with Noah and the flood, it gets almost completely wiped out except for Noah. But the point is, you don't like fasten on the metaphorical meaning and then forget about the literal meaning. It doesn't work like that. A lot of things can be literal and metaphorical at the same time. So yes, Noah did that. All that stuff did happen. He really did have an ark, and he took his family on there, and there really was a terrible flood. He took all these animals onto the boat that could have been like a lot of different species, because there aren't really that many. I mean, all the species today can be based on variations of a few basic models. Like, look at the dog, all the different models you could get off of that. You know, the cat, or biologists today would say, oh, that's ridiculous because the biodiversity on this planet is just so complicated and immense, and we're discovering new species every second. But honestly, I think you guys have just overblown it a bit. I mean, come on, the sparrow's beak is a little different. Darwin, the sparrow's beak, oh, it's a tiny little different here on this island. There's some basic models, and then there's probably other things that have legitimately been lost. Maybe there probably was more biodiversity before the flood. Obviously, the dinosaurs aren't around anymore. But what I'm doing here, I'm getting into the science here. I'm showing that, yeah, you can actually examine the literal angle, and you should, but don't ever think that it doesn't fully make sense literally. I can't square this totally with science. Don't ever think that therefore there's something wrong with it. Because then you have to see, oh, okay, maybe there's a supernatural angle. So Jonah being swallowed by a whale, by a supernatural whale. I mean, I don't know. You don't have to. God doesn't owe it to us. That it's like, you see, this is actually what I meant. What is science, and what are the academies? What are the universities today? They're nothing less than pretentious of being the new church. They effectively already are the new church. So you can't make theology or religion subservient to logic, because you need sacred principles, or just blandly just call them axioms. And then you from that you base your logic on, and all the rest of your worldview. So the principles you're going to have are going to be pretty important. They're going to shape how your society behaves over many generations. If things get changed a little bit earlier on, you might not see the change right away. Letting down the injunction against usury, which is interest payment, they did that a few hundred years ago, and it didn't get out of hand right away, but look at the world we're living in today. All the enslavement that brings. Nothing against debt, but against interest. That's just one example of how these theological things can have real consequences for your society. So Ramsey Paul says he believes in evolution and creation by God, and he says that when I say these things are incompatible, that I'm making a false dichotomy. If you start taking this approach of, oh, it's just metaphor, and applying this to a lot of the key Orthodox Christian teachings, then I think you can be in a situation where this starts to snowball, because, oh, if man's creation by God is just metaphor, and actually he came from the animals. What else is metaphor in the Bible? Is Jesus as God actually just metaphorical? Like, well, he was an enlightened human. He wasn't actually God, part of the Trinity. Okay, and then if that's not true, then is God the Father a person? Or is he just a divine simplicity, like an essence that has no arms or legs or head? This is something which Protestant and Catholic theologians have wavered on in recent centuries. They've wavered in affirming the personhood of God. That is serious stuff. That's going to affect your culture over the generations. I think obviously overall Catholic culture has been more orthodox than Protestant culture. That's why it has maintained more I guess you could say, cohesion. I mean, of course, that's suffered, and there's been a lot of the same corruption. Ramsey Paul's nationalism is more of an Americanism, which is fine, I guess, but the emphasis on Christianity is pretty loose and not very well defined. So how you're going to hearken and call upon Christianity to help you in your nationalist cause, that's a bit more murky now, because theology is important, but America never was so unified theologically from the beginning, from the Puritans for over 400 years. That's kind of how it's been. It's been a Protestant, the fulfilling of the Protestant experiment in many ways, to the point where I could start a church. I'm pretty sure I could start a church in Canada or in the US if I wanted to. I could register a church and just have a congregation, which I think is really crazy, because who am I to do that? Are you kidding? People in the past would have been like, is he a priest? Is he trained? You say, what? A man on the street just created a church and he's got a congregation? It's yeah, he has. More and more are coming every day. He has several hundred people now. They give him money. He has the Spirit. This is the sort of thing that can go on. And bringing rock and roll and just music and the consumer culture into Christian. I'm going to be talking about that in a book review in the future. So I won't say too much here. But that's not something that God wants. Liturgy, that's supposed to be a specific thing. It's not supposed to be anything goes. Protestantism totally lost that hierarchical system. I mean, I guess maybe there was Anglicanism in England, but that's a shell, a husk of its former self. I think England or the UK is one of the least Christian places in Europe at the moment. I mean, America has a lot of churches that do hold communities together, but it's just, if you're talking about you want unity and you want working together, having all these thousands of denominations, that's not going to help. A lot of it has to do with you have different worldviews. You haven't agreed on fundamental principles, and it's okay, but then you're going to be divided amongst yourselves, and I don't think that's what was ever intended by Christ or by the apostles. So if you're questioning that God is a person or God the Father is a person, that's going to have effects on how you behave as a society. How would you relate to God if you knew he was a person, as opposed to how would you relate to God if you knew that he was not a person? He's just some essence out there. I can't even begin to contemplate all the things that would open up and the changes that would lead to. But for one thing, we wouldn't feel quite so involved with God. There probably wouldn't be quite a sense of obligation. So religions have always been arguably the most important aspect of maintaining any civilization. Byzantium lasted very long for a civilization, arguably the longest European or semi-European civilization, certainly the longest Christian civilization. It lasted almost 1,000 years, roughly, I mean, wherever you trace the beginning of it. So Ramsey Paul wants to help his people. He wants his people to endure and their freedoms to endure. He recognizes that the globalists, the multinational corporations, most governments in the world are all hostile to us. And I'm sure he would agree that these actors, these entities, see us as animals. They see most humans as expendable animals. And thereby, they don't think we should be treated much differently than animals are treated. But that's the thing about evolution. If you accept it, can you really argue against these globalists who are treating us like animals? Are you in a good position to question the globalists? Because if you believe in evolution, it doesn't matter what you say. We are animals. You can say, oh, well, we're really well developed. We're very smart. Our genes were the best. And it's like, yeah, that very well may be. But at the end of the day, you're still an animal. And there never were any fundamental sacred principles guiding you other than passing on your genes and physical things, survival of the fittest and all of that stuff. You're shooting yourself in the foot here. Because humans are made in the image of God, we cannot be treated as animals. And I'm not trying to get into the talk of rights. Rights is a very difficult, that's just a can of worms. I don't want to open that up. But obviously there is an obligation to act with love and with justice towards our fellow human beings around the world. There is a universal principle there. There is. So Ramsey Paul may very well still believe much of what the Christian teachings are, but I'm just trying to point out that this kind of thinking, if not right away, over the generations, will inevitably lead to atheism. And atheism is synonymous with decadence in your culture. So when you're trying to deal with the cultural controllers, the cultural programmers, you don't want to concede evolution to them, because that's a primary aspect of how they control us. You don't want to debate them on turf which suits them. But even then, it's not even a question of what turf, because if you had something which is true, then you can just stick to that. So, but then again, I guess nationalists they're not trying to debate these people. They're not interested in any of this stuff. These Christians like Ramsey Paul, they basically accommodate what is called theistic evolution, which is just, the religion and evolution, we'll have it together. If you take the theistic evolutionary approach, you'll inevitably end up trying to defend your religion if you care about it, but you'll be doing so in the realm of science rather than just going straight, sticking to your spiritual guns. That doesn't mean you don't think. That doesn't mean you don't try to be rational. But you know what your priorities are. You know from where your worldview proceeds. Then you're going to be thinking more clearly, because you got that figured out. It's coherent. But no, if you go the theistic evolutionary approach, then you'll be saying, well, this study and that study and this theory, and you see. It starts becoming very new agey. By the way, like the false prophet thing, I know I wasn't so clear that that was a role-playing video where I was coming at you as if a different person, the false prophet. So obviously everything I've said in this video I meant personally. And but I don't think Ramsey Paul is a false prophet by any means. I'm not trying to apply that to him. But, certain teachings, certain ideas, they might come from a false prophet. I was much at fault of the same thing. I mean, some of my earlier videos, I would have maybe taken a theistic evolutionary approach, when I was younger. So, but, you keep thinking about it. You keep trying to make things coherent. Hasta luego, amigos.